may I add something to that? I mean, again, just a way I'm thinking up loud. I think that we can all agree that there is no difference in a life of somebody living in Aleppo, or somebody living in Paris, or somebody living in Cambridge, Ontario, or going to school in Cambridge, Ontario. You can use different language, different metaphors to describe it. We're all equal as children of God. We are all of us have an equal right to exist because we're born. And that means that at the level of the individual, the death of somebody in Aleppo and the death of somebody in Paris or the death of somebody in Cambridge, Ontario is an equal tragedy. However, if we look at it at a level of, let's call the aspiration, in some way, what we try to do as humanity, and we do not really agree on that, all of us, but you can say that there is something that we try to achieve collectively. Yeah? Create a good world or whatever like that. Then at a certain moment you can say that there are deaths which take on a very much larger meaning for us. When I was young, one of the great stories that propelled me in some way to think and to become who I was a story of the death of Robert Scott. Now, Robert Scott was a polar explorer. Yeah? And he basically tried to reach the South Pole as the first man in 1911. And he arrived there and he found that the Norwegian Amundsen had just been before him. So he found there a Norwegian flag on the South Pole. And on the way back he died. In some way this seemed to be an incredibly, incredibly tragic death. Now why is it so tragic? Because, in some way this was a story about heroism, a story about discovery, a story about humanity trying to in some way understanding this earth and willing individual humans to take this incredible risk. And then this incredible disappointment after all he had done. He devoted a life for it, and he just arrives there, and just, a week earlier, Amundsen had reached the pole. If he had reached the pole as a first person and then had died, it would not have been a tragic death. But because he had this disappointment, it's all our disappointment. And so I think that in some way what happens is that, sometimes I think, and go back to Auschwitz. What's the meaning of Auschwitz? Now, I need to pull back and take a view of a Martian. What happens if this world blows itself up with nuclear arms? We have a decent chance of doing that. As a species, we have a decent chance of destroying ourselves. I mean, we've been living with that since 1945, or maybe 1949. I certainly grew up in a world where nuclear extermination of the whole world was on the table every day. So, now if we are going to say this were to happen, then we can say there are 6 billion individual tragedies there. But if I were a Martian looking back at the Earth, knowing our Earth history, knowing how we have treated each other as human beings, I might say this is not great loss for the universe. 6 billion individual tragedies, yes, but that humanity is gone, who cares? They built the gas chambers. They don't deserve any better. I don't want to say that I agree with this Martian view on the Earth exploding, but I think it is a way to actually start to, in some way, look at, I think, death of individual human beings in terms of a larger context, and to say we always will have to acknowledge the individual tragedy. The question is, the larger historic significance of it may differ from atrocity to atrocity, from incident, from death to death.
Can I come in around that?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, somebody else can speak, but there's two crucial things that this murder has completely, right now, demolished as narratives. On Friday morning, if you said Paris and you were in the news or you were dealing with global economics or you were dealing with governance, what would you think? Paris this month is the site of potentially the next stage in something actually quite important, which would be a treaty on global warming. That's the thing, for instance, our Prime Minister said, I'm taking all the premiers and I'm taking all of the leaders of the opposition with me. We're all getting on side with whatever we can work out there. That's probably, that narrative's hijacked. That narrative is destroyed unless people can put this murder behind them. That's number one. Another narrative, much larger again, in this country we've got 25,000. Now, the very conservative Premier of Saskatchewan is making news right now by saying, I'm counseling us to reconsider this. You kind of go, why? Those people are running from the same assholery that did Paris. It's not my, who's it used the word this week to describe this? It was the best. John Oliver. John Oliver did it best, you know. I don't care if this is a war of cultures, the French are winning, okay? Forget it. They invented pastry. They win, you know. They invented Gaulois, they win. I thought he was wonderful. But the way this murder, a small murder in light of the bombing, a single day's bombing in Aleppo, has stolen two very important narratives, which is up to 500,000 people at the gates of Europe saying, please let us in because we can't go back. And a conference that may or may not accomplish something, but we should at least give them another crack at it on the problem of global warming, which really is probably going to be our end. It won't be nuclear until we actually start to have nuclear wars over water, which would seem to be entirely possible within 30 years. We'll definitely have more wars about water. We already have wars about water in East Africa. I think what's also interesting is the way terror manages to hijack the much more important narratives that we all share. And those, the narratives of the refugees is a huge narrative. The narrative of global warming is probably a colossal narrative. We're deaf to them because we're hunting down one creep. I can hear about the manhunt for one creep. This is a James Bond movie. We're going to find this master villain. He's a 24-year-old creep, you know, who managed to smuggle some Kalashnikovs into France. That would seem to be his gift. They'll get him. They get everybody. They'll get him. But, you know, what happens to the Paris conference? Who knows? All we know now is, as everyone says, they're closing their borders. Everyone is contracting like a bowel in anxiety. And that's a much nastier narrative, I think. Sorry. So, someone else should get
that. I think just continuing on this idea of feelings and narratives, I think there's definitely personally the sense of confusion and also kind of unbelieving the reality of it. I think in a way almost the monumentality of 9/11 is easier, and the symbology of it is easier to believe than somebody going in to downtown on a Friday night at a concert, something that is probably familiar to a lot of us, and killing 90 people that are there to enjoy music. For some reason, that still doesn't seem real. And I think also this idea of confusion, that, again, the confusion of feelings and the what do you feel, and also like what Philip was saying, I definitely had this sense that with this, I want it to change me, but what that change is, I have no idea, and how that can be beneficial, I think, is still very unsure.
Do you know how many people have died by drone attacks on wedding parties in the last 10 years? Over 600 in Afghanistan, Yemen, and Iraq.
I think another part
Having
of
a
that too,
wedding
though,
party,
is
and some guy doesn't walk up with a Kalashnikov. It comes from out of the blue and goes, they're gone. I think that the murders in Paris, which are atrocious, should actually get us engaged in the thought experiment of what everyone else in the world is going through all the time right now.
right.
I do agree.
Well, I think there's another part of it
It's
too,
like going to
though.
a club.
Looking into the refuge and like what's happening here. People are not assaulting Muslim women in Toronto because of bombings in Beirut. They're doing it because of what happened in Paris, and I think that also kind of forces a deeper questioning of that.
Well,
As
no.
much as like on this scale of life, they are both important and both equal.
Without a doubt, as opposed to, for instance, apologizing to them,
Right.
which might be more appropriate, right? No, I agree. I mean, narcissism is everywhere and always in effect. Look at me. It's all.
Maybe, I'm not a therapist at all in any way, but I wouldn't be worried that you're confused and that you're going to be confused. I am confused. I think all of us are confused. I mean, Philip very clearly talked about his confusion. And I think all of us have I also am afraid. I say let's not be afraid, but I say it because I know I'm afraid. I mean, I have been going through scenarios, what happens if something happens in this school. Yeah? And it was very clear because when I started teaching here, we had the massacre in a Montreal college. And the gunmen coming into a lecture room and separating the men from the women. And the men left and the women were killed. It was a very powerful experience for me as a young teacher. What would I do if that were to happen? Or they would separate the Muslims from the Christians or the Christians from the Jews. Make any separation. And it takes some time to, I think, find an answer. And your answer will also change over time. So don't be afraid for the confusion. I think that is the confusion is only a beginning. And ultimately, it will shape, this will shape you. This conversation maybe also, in addition to what happened a few days ago. That's why I think it's important to have the conversation. I think it's important to give a collective hug together here. I mean, this is what really this is about also. I mean, to realize we're not alone, that you're not alone with confusion, I am not alone with my confusion. Yeah? And so don't be afraid of that. And ultimately, you'll find a way, and then you get confused about that. I mean, we'll remain confused until we're dead. So, I mean, that's the beauty of it. And that, is probably why we engaged in quote-unquote creativity, to try to sort these things out.
I mean, I was just going to say, and I'm not too sure how that's going to come out, but this idea of change I think you're talking about the good positive change and how do I take this in and where do I go from here? I think one of the aspects that worries me is and then I think, to state the obvious, like one of the reasons, of course, why this sort of in some ways hits home, or like you feel like more closely, like you in some ways taken by what's happening, is the kind of proximity, but this unexpected dimension of, well, if you're in a place where there's been war or bombs blow up all the time, then it's kind of part of your reality and you deal with it, and we get used to these things in some ways. We get used to some horrible things that to such a sense that we're desensitized to it. We have not yet been desensitized to what's happening in Paris. And I'm saying that's a good thing, but I'm just sort of reflecting back on what's happening. I think what worries me about change is that I think what that provokes when such events happen, so for example, the Polytechnique in Montreal, or what happens at other shootings in different schools, or larger terrorist acts, is that we always try to plan for the worst case scenarios. When I was registering my girl, who I was thinking of putting her in first grade here at Highland, I was 5 minutes in the school, and the only thing I knew after the first half hour, my daughter was not yet registered, is that they explained to me very clearly how they would do the shutdown, like how they would shut down the school in case a terrorist would come in. That's all I knew after half an hour. And I'm thinking, I wonder what, like, I'm thinking about education here, and maybe but that's actually what happened. And I think for them, they were in some ways giving me the assurance that she will be fine. But that really worries me, that actually we're always, the change has to do with, well, lock your door, get more insurance, make sure this doesn't happen. And that way, we're in some ways, we're armed for it. And I'm not too sure, like that's an escalation. So I don't know if the change is to be, yes, to learn to fear or not fear, or acknowledge your fear and say, well, but I can be stronger than this. And I'm talking just from experience of just seeing where does that lead to if ultimately the first is one of mistrust. What happens if we don't, like, I think that just can start to affect the way we deal with everyone, just the fact that we think that if the door is unlocked and bringing that back to like a very mundane experience, everyday experience. But I think for me it's this, how we see the neighbors, people in the class, people in the community, people of our faith, of different faiths, and I'm just trying to say, well, perhaps there's something about this that we need to reassert, that these are maybe exceptional, and then it's not to say that we push them aside, but we try to go back on what means living together in the best positive manner.
What you are thinking about this, the question of locking the door. What do you think of the open doors movement that is alive in Paris right now?
Well, I'm not too familiar with the open doors movement in Paris, but I was thinking, kind of touching along a lot of what the sentiments are. There's this sort of like retraction that everybody's got sucked in, and I think that's what they wanted to cause, because it's not as if after ISIS claimed responsibility for the attacks that they asked for $10 billion or something like that. There was no claim made in why they did what they did. And much like fueling jets and going and bombing something instantly to kind of feel like we've done something about it, I think that's what they wanted out of everybody. So kind of touching back on, well, do we, when struck, strike back or sort of stand down? I almost think it would be more of a symbolic stance if everyone kind of didn't react in the way they wanted. Kind of like when you're on the playground and there's a bully picking on you, and he wants you to react, he wants you to strike back, and wants to change the nature of your person about you. And I think that's kind of what's shifting, because touching back on the refugees, there's a lot of people that are criticizing Trudeau for not changing his perspective on welcoming 25,000 people to Canada, which is something that we're known for, is welcoming people. And personally too, I have some skepticism about that, because people have said that a lot of some of the people that were part of the attacks in Paris may have claimed that they were refugees coming through Greece and then into Paris.
Everybody but one
Right.
were
Were
native French
native.
or Belgians.
Sure, but there was one, and that one is enough to cast doubt into a sea to say, well, that's one of however many. If we let 25,000 into Canada, who's to say there's not one or two? And I think it's the right thing to do to bring refugees into Canada and live up to what we are as Canadians. But there's still that hesitation almost that we could be next in that sense.
I think I just have a few thoughts on this.
Can you stand?
Yeah. Starting off from what you were saying, I think the one thing about bringing people as refugees is it's a lot harder to try and go bomb a civilization if your cousins live over there. I think if you actually have family, I think it's actually, the reactionary in terms of military force, all that does is just make the next generation angrier that you bomb their grandfather and their grandparents. And I think it's, I think what we should almost be trying to do is, change the narrative and just charm the pants off of them. It's even in, the Christian idea of turn the other cheek, yes, we're here, we're going to be nice people, we're going to, you can try and destroy us as much as you like, But we're just going to continue to be here. It'd be nice if you'd stop, but I think part of their, like at the terrorist group, they've created a fear of us amongst the people that they've gotten to support them. And if we can kind of undermine that fear that they're working off of to attack us, then I think that's going to be much more successful than trying to bomb.
I would agree, but I also like to introduce a concept into this, which actually comes out of economics, but I think it's perfectly appropriate here, which is the concept of a black swan. Nobody's seen a black swan, but that doesn't mean one doesn't exist. And you can't plan for them. And when one shows up, if it does show up, it upsets all of your sense of world order, and then you go on again. In economics, they are those economic things that no forecasting formula sees. The fact that these guys played Merry Hell for 3 hours is to say, how many people have spent time recently in Paris? You could play a kind of drinking game called Spot the Machine Gun. Like you realize, hey, I must be in the neighborhood of a consulate because I can count 20 machine guns in a block, right? This is a city full of armed men. It has been a city full of armed men all my adult life. I've traveled through Paris, and there's greater or lesser numbers of often quite heavily armed guys. 3 hours. These guys played Merry Hell before they got caught or gave up, rather than blew themselves up. I think the notion of sitting there saying we're going to predict this or even to live in fear of it is actually almost inappropriate because we can't. They'll think up something new. I remember giving up an essay that I was working on in the early part of this century on asymmetric warfare, because in the last chapters the authors arrived at a very simple conclusion. It said, in future asymmetric warfare will make use of the instruments of peace that of our peaceful civil culture in order to make war on us. For instance, they will seize our airliners and drive them into our cities. At that point I thought, I'm not going on with this question anymore because they're right, and this is not something I write about anymore. I stopped. And a few years later, that's of course what happens. The fact that it doesn't happen a lot is impressive. That Americans have actually claimed domination of the air over almost all the places where they're engaged in anything right now. That is to say, that reversed. Those 3,300 people dead in New York have been paid back 100-fold with drones in the air. But I suspect the whole sense of any reaction to fear is simply almost irrational. But fear is, of course, irrational, and most of the time. And I think that this one is.
Can I make one thing to Patrick's remark, and then last week I was taped for the agenda for a conversation on the refugee situation in Europe. And so on Saturday I thought I'm going to write Stephen Bacon that maybe it wouldn't be a good idea to broadcast. It was an hour's discussion and maybe it's not so relevant anymore. And so earlier today I got an email that they're cancelling it because it's events have overtaken it, and I congratulate them on it. And then I said what I was going to do, and I said, we're actually having a meeting here today in the school. I think it's important we talk about it. And I'm going to talk, I think that I'm going to talk about Karl Popper. And then the producer, Wojtek Zemberg, a very good friend of mine, wrote back, yes, but I hope, before you go in, I hope that you're not going to advocate the beautiful soul solution. The beautiful soul is actually a concept that was formulated by Kierkegaard, a 19th century existentialist philosopher. And it is in some way the turning the other cheek model. It is basically taking the Christian idea and say, okay, when something really bad happens, you in some way turn the other cheek, and then it happens, you allow it to happen again. And the argument, of course, is that while this on an individual level might be something you might decide to do, I, as a person who has some responsibility, also let this responsibility in this very small community, or a politician who has a national responsibility, cannot simply do that. That I, as a professor and as a person who is charged with a few others here in front to basically guide this institution, I have a responsibility to keep you as safe as possible. Yeah? I mean, that's one of my jobs also. It's not that explicit, but, you know, I have some influence in how this works.
Hard to discharge.
Yeah. And so politicians, they have a responsibility to keep us safe. Now the question, of course, is then, so they cannot so easily turn the other cheek. As a politician, as an individual they can, but not as a politician. So that's where we get into very complex issues of what can we legitimately do to protect ourselves in a, let's call it an efficient or in a rational way. Now, one of the reasons I like Popper is because Popper always goes back to rationality. Yeah? He says you can figure this out. What is proportionate? What is proportionate? And what is disproportionate? And reasonable people can talk about it as we do today. And we can disagree, and we can agree, and we can find some way where we probably, most of us, will be able to agree on a course of action. And that's exactly why we talk this evening.
So, speaking to taking kind of a course of action, my question is, what do we as students, or what can we as students and kind of a younger student body who are distanced from attacks but now are more aware of it, what can we do in response? Because I remember, like, when 9/11 happened, I was 8 years old, and I was born and raised in Canada, but as soon as that happened, all of a sudden, I was no longer just Canadian, I was a Canadian Muslim. And so when I heard about the Paris attacks, my initial response was, well, shit, because, but then my second response was, well, you know what, it's now, again, like 9/11, it's something that's closer to home. So, but obviously, it's closer where everyone's more aware of it, people are talking about it, and I think that's a good thing. But what can we do as students? Because I remember then my next feeling was, well, you know, what do I do now? I'm a student, I'm in Cambridge, I want to do something, but I don't know what.
Could I make a suggestion? This would be extreme, but it would actually, A, be positive, and B, would probably help you address your own souls in this case. So say, this is a big population of people. There's over 400 people already to the school one way or the other. Why can't we sponsor one family? See, that would in fact say, here's how we're addressing this. We're not turning the other cheek, we're going to address this by being kind, babies. We're going to address this with love. We're going to demonstrate that we're not cowed, that we're not going to back off, that we're not afraid. We're certainly not afraid of people coming here, which this is the 200th anniversary of my family coming here. They came as political refugees. They were cleared out of the world they lived in. They came here, and ever since, somebody in the family has been named for the guy who paid for the boat. You know, maybe it's time for us to pay for a boat, you know, get somebody in. And they may thank you 200 years later. I mean, my daughter still, her middle name is Selkirk. There's one in every generation. He's the guy who paid for the boat and found some land for them. He sponsored them. Us, me, my tribe. You know, so yeah, that, you know, I would say you have to do it. I wouldn't want to make you feel guilty for not doing it, but I'd say that would be an incredibly, coherent response. It probably requires more energy than you've got right now, because your architecture students under the thumb of this institution and all that other stuff, but that might be something. There may be other things too. Talking here tonight probably is one of them.
When 9/11 happened, I was in Muscat, Oman, a Muslim country in the Middle East, and the next day when I went to school, I got made fun of because all my friends knew that I was immigrating to Canada, and Canada was the other. We were North America, and at the time, the home front was on attack. You know, the enemy was where I am today, and so I've somehow had the benefit of being able to live in different places that allow me to shift my perspective, where the other is now home and vice versa. And I wonder if, and it's hard for people who don't have that opportunity to think the way that I can think. So that's just a thought I want to put out there.
That's profound, actually. That's quite impressive. Because, yeah, I think there'd be an enormous number of people who would have felt remarkable. Well, I know there were an enormous number of people who felt quite triumphant about 9/11. It's a kind of act. And I think it's interesting to sort of engage in that thought experiment, too.